Today, I take you through one of the most impactful events recorded in Texas during the war. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The light was harsh that June morning. Not the gentle kind that painters capture, but the unforgiving Texas summer sun that seemed to press down on Galveston Island like a weight. Records from the Galveston Daily News described the 19th of June, 1865, as uncommonly warm, even by Gulf standards. What those clinical words failed to capture was the weight of history about to unfold on those sun-baked streets. Major General Gordon Granger had arrived the previous day aboard the USS Fort Jackson. His orders were straightforward, yet the impact would echo for generations. What happened in Galveston that day began 2.5 years earlier, when President Abraham Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. That document, preserved now in the National Archives, declared all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state shall be thenceforward, and forever free. Yet as the official dispatches show, the words penned in Washington often traveled slowly to the furthest corners of the divided nation. Some places, like Texas, remained virtually untouched by this proclamation until long after its signing. Military correspondence indicates that Granger's assignment was to command the Department of Texas. But his first General Order No. 3 would become his most significant act. The original document, reportedly read aloud at multiple locations throughout Galveston, stated, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free." Simple words. Yet for approximately 250,000 people still enslaved in Texas, these words represented the delayed arrival of a freedom long withheld. What the official military records don't adequately capture is why this news took so long to reach Texas. Some accounts suggest deliberate suppression. Others point to the geographical isolation of the state. A third theory, noted in personal papers of a Union quartermaster named Harold Wilkinson, suggests that federal messengers sent to deliver the news had been intercepted or killed. His journal, found decades later during a renovation of a Houston courthouse in 1941, contained a troubling entry. Heard today that Captain Myers never made it past the Sabine with the proclamation papers. Third such messenger to disappear. The delay raises questions that even now remain incompletely answered. How could news of such magnitude take 30 months to travel? Was it merely poor communication in wartime, or something more deliberate? The incomplete telegraph logs from 1863 show multiple transmitted messages regarding emancipation to various states, but conspicuously absent are records of successful transmissions to Texas authorities. A gap that historians have never fully explained. What we do know comes from fragmentary accounts. Diary entries from plantation owners show some were fully aware of the Emancipation Proclamation, but continued to hold people in bondage. One such diary, belonging to a Jefferson County plantation owner named Richard Parsons, contains the damning entry from October 1863. News from Virginia most troubling. Lincoln's proclamation apparently being enforced where Union forces have control. Must prepare for possibility of similar circumstances, though I expect we shall have warning enough to make arrangements. This carefully worded entry suggests foreknowledge without compliance. Military records indicate that even as the Civil War effectively ended with Lee's surrender at Appomattox in April 1865, Texas remained largely under Confederate control. The final battle of the Civil War occurred in May at Palmito Ranch, Texas, with a Confederate victory more than a month after Lee's surrender. This anomaly of history underscores Texas's isolation, both geographical and informational. According to quartermaster logs, Union supply lines barely reached into the Texas interior, making enforcement of federal proclamations virtually impossible without a substantial military presence. What happened after Granger's announcement is documented in contradictory accounts. Official reports claim an orderly transition, yet personal testimonies tell a different story. Former enslaved persons, in accounts collected by Federal Writers Project interviewers between 1936 and 1938, described reactions ranging from jubilation to confusion to fear. One account from Felix Haywood, recorded when he was 82 years old, stated, "We all walked on golden clouds. Everybody went wild. We felt like heroes, and nobody had made us that way but ourselves." These narratives contrast sharply with municipal records showing that in the weeks following June 19th, local ordinances were quickly established restricting movement and employment of newly freed people. A Galveston City Council record dated July 7, 1865, shows the passage of what they called public safety measures that effectively criminalized unemployment among former enslaved persons. Those without proof of employment could be arrested for vagrancy. These measures, passed just 18 days after emancipation was announced, reveal how quickly freedom was circumscribed. Then there are the unexplained disappearances. Military police reports from July and August 1865 document numerous cases of freed people who vanished while traveling between plantations and towns. One report from a Lieutenant James Morrison of the Freedmen's Bureau, dated August 12, 1865, states, "Investigated disappearance of family of 6 traveling from Harris County Plantation to Houston. No trace found." This marks the 12th such report this month. Local authorities show little interest in pursuing these matters. The reports stop abruptly in September, with no resolution noted in surviving records. What these documents collectively reveal is not a moment of liberation, but a prolonged struggle. The formal announcement of freedom represented not an endpoint, but a beginning, the start of a new chapter filled with both possibility and peril. Census records from 1870 show that many formerly enslaved people remained in the same counties, often working for former enslavers under different but similarly restrictive conditions. Agricultural production reports indicate that cotton output in Texas dropped only temporarily before rebounding, suggesting limited economic disruption despite the massive social change emancipation represented. Perhaps most telling are the records of celebration. While no contemporary accounts exist of how June 19th was marked in 1865 by 1866, newspaper accounts describe gatherings of freed people commemorating the date. The Galveston Daily News from June 20th, 1866, mentions with evident disapproval a congregation of Negroes celebrating their supposed day of liberation with unseemly displays. This backhanded documentation inadvertently preserved evidence of what would become known as Juneteenth celebrations. The historical record grows clearer as the decades pass. Documents from the 1880s show that Juneteenth celebrations had become traditional in many Texas communities. Land records indicate that in 1872, a group of former enslaved people pooled $10,000 to purchase 10 acres of land in Houston for the specific purpose of holding Juneteenth celebrations. This land, purchased by Reverend Jack Yates and others, became Emancipation Park, one of the few physical landmarks from this period that still exists today. What remains most difficult to document is the human experience, the moment when individuals first heard the words that legally transformed them from property to citizens. No cameras captured those expressions. No recording devices preserve those first reactions. What survives instead are second-hand accounts, collected decades later, filtered through memory and time. One such account comes from Laura Smalley, who was enslaved in Limestone County. In an interview recorded in 1941, she recalled, "The master, he didn't tell, they was free. Old master didn't tell them they was free. They worked there, I think now they say they worked them 6 months after that, 6 months, and turned them loose on the 19th of June. That's why, we celebrate that day." Her account, preserved now in the Library of Congress, contains a detail easy to overlook. They worked 6 more months before being told. This pattern appears in multiple testimonies, suggesting that even after Granger's announcement in Galveston, the news spread unevenly across the state, delayed intentionally on some plantations. Military correspondence supports this, with reports from Freedmen's Bureau agents throughout 1865 and 1866 documenting their discovery of plantations where emancipation had never been announced. These reports become less frequent by 1867, but never entirely disappear. What we call Juneteenth marks not a single day of emancipation, but the beginning of a protracted process that unfolded unevenly across Texas and the defeated Confederacy. For some, freedom came that day in Galveston. For others, it arrived weeks, months, or even years later. Some historical estimates suggest that as late as 1870, there were still isolated cases of enslaved people who had never been formally told of their legal freedom. This delayed and uneven emancipation created a complicated legacy. Pension records from the early 1900s show that many formerly enslaved people could not precisely document their date of emancipation when applying for benefits, leading to denied claims. Census records from 1870 and 1880 show dramatic population movements as freed people searched for family members separated during slavery, creating documentation challenges that echo into the present day for genealogists and historians. The story of Juneteenth is ultimately about information: who controlled it, how it traveled, and what happened in its absence. Major General Granger's orders traveled slowly across Texas, facing both physical obstacles and human resistance. Every plantation, farm, and household where enslaved people lived became its own front line in this final phase of the war, not a war fought with cannons and muskets, but with information, rumors, silence, and finally, delayed words of freedom. In archives across Texas and the nation, the documentary record of this transition remains fragmentary. Courthouse fires, deliberate record destruction, and the passage of time have left gaps in our understanding that may never be filled. Yet what does survive tells an unmistakable story of both profound change and disturbing continuity, of freedom proclaimed but often not fully realized. Military intelligence reports from the Department of Texas throughout 1866 express frustration with local resistance to emancipation. One report from Captain Charles Johnson, dated March 1866, states, "The people here acknowledge defeat, but not change. They accept the letter of emancipation while violating its spirit at every opportunity." Johnson was found dead 3 weeks after filing this report. The military investigation concluded it was typhoid fever, though his personal physician had noted no symptoms in an examination 4 days before his death. The full story of how freedom finally reached the last enslaved Americans remains partially obscured. What is clear from the surviving records is that June 19, 1865, marked not the end of the struggle, but another phase in the long fight for genuine freedom, a fight documented in military records, personal testimonies, land deeds, newspaper accounts, and cemetery plots across Texas. The echoes of that day continue to resonate, not just in celebrations and commemorations, but in the ongoing work of understanding what freedom truly means, how it is won, and how easily it can be undermined when information is controlled and justice delayed. The story of Juneteenth reminds us that proclamations alone do not create freedom. Paper guarantees require enforcement, information requires transmission, and rights require recognition to become reality. The delayed emancipation in Texas stands as a historical caution about the gap that can exist between law as written and law as experienced. A gap that has narrowed over time, but has never entirely closed. Records from the Federal Writers Project contain one final testament worth noting. A formerly enslaved man named Felix Haywood, interviewed when he was 82 years old, was asked about the day he learned of his freedom. His response cuts through the historical fog with clarity. The end of the war. It come just like that, like you snap your fingers. Hallelujah broke out. Soldiers all of a sudden was everywhere, coming in bunches, crossing and walking and riding. Everyone was a-singing. We was all walking on golden clouds. Everybody went wild. We felt like heroes, and nobody had made us that way but ourselves. We was free. Just like that, we was free. What military dispatches, government proclamations, and official histories, sometimes obscure, Haywood's simple testimony makes clear. June 19th may mark a date on the calendar, but freedom arrives not when proclaimed by others, but when finally heard, understood, and seized by those to whom it belongs by natural right. The documents tell us what happened. The testimonies tell us what it meant. Together, they form the incomplete but essential record of a day long delayed but never forgotten. 100 years after Granger's announcement, a researcher at Prairie View A&M University discovered a sealed packet of documents in a courthouse archive, apparently misplaced in 1867 and never catalogued properly. Inside was a handwritten letter dated August 18, 1865, from a plantation owner to his son. The changes forced upon us are temporary. Our way of life cannot be abolished by proclamation. Those who understand the natural order will find ways to preserve it under different names. The letter was accompanied by a contract offering employment to formerly enslaved people under terms that effectively recreated their previous condition through debt, restricted movement, and threat of arrest. Such documents reveal the reality behind the statistics showing that many freed people remained in circumstances barely distinguishable from slavery. The archives tell us that Juneteenth marks not a clean break with the past, but the beginning of a new struggle, one documented in military reports, legislative records, personal testimonies, newspaper accounts, and grave markers across Texas. It reminds us that freedom is never given, only taken, never granted, only won, and that the distance between a proclamation of liberty and its realization can be measured not just in miles, but in years, decades, and generations. As a final note, the military report closing the Department of Texas operations in 1870 contains this observation from the commanding officer. The work begun by General Granger's Order No. 3 remains incomplete. While legal bondage has been eliminated, its shadow persists in custom, practice, and attitude. I fear we leave behind a promise only partially fulfilled. That assessment, written 155 years ago, stands as both historical observation and ongoing challenge, a reminder that the story which began on June 19th, 1865, continues to unfold, with chapters still being written in the struggle to transform a proclamation of freedom into its lived reality. The records that survive from the years immediately following June 19, 1865, paint a complex picture of freedom's aftermath. Land ownership records from 1870 to 1890 show that while some formerly enslaved people managed to acquire property, their holdings remained minimal compared to white landowners. The Texas Land Office archives contain numerous instances of disputed claims, where freed people who had worked land for years after emancipation were ultimately denied ownership through legal maneuvers or outright intimidation. Postal records from the period 1865 to 1875 reveal another dimension of the post-emancipation experience. the search for family members separated during slavery. The volume of inquiries was so great that several Texas postmasters created dedicated filing systems for what they called Freedmen's Search Letters. One such collection, discovered during a 1938 courthouse renovation in Jefferson County, contained over 300 letters, most unanswered or marked addressee unknown. Each represents a family fractured, a connection severed, and an attempted reunion that often led nowhere. Economic data tells another part of the story. Agricultural production reports from 1865 through 1875 show that while the plantation system was nominally dismantled, new arrangements emerged that created similar economic dependencies. The system of sharecropping, documented in county agricultural records, reveals that many freed people ended up working the same land under different but equally exploitative terms. Census data from 1870 and 1880 shows minimal improvements in material conditions for the formerly enslaved population, with asset ownership remaining drastically below that of white residents. Meanwhile, records from the Freedmen's Bureau, established to assist formerly enslaved people in the transition to freedom, document both the aspirations and obstacles faced by the newly free population. Education was a primary focus, with Bureau reports showing the establishment of schools across Texas. One report from November 1865 notes, "The desire for education among the freed people exceeds our capacity to provide it. Schools operate from dawn until well after dark, with children attending during daylight hours and adults arriving after work, often walking miles after laboring since sunrise. These schools operated in the face of significant local resistance, with Bureau records documenting 43 instances of school burnings in Texas between 1865 and 1868. Military correspondence from the occupation period reveals the tenuous nature of the freedom being established. A report from Captain William Parker, stationed in Henderson County in February 1866, states, "Local authorities cooperate with federal directives when directly observed, but evidence suggests systematic undermining of Bureau efforts when no federal personnel are present. Freed people report widespread intimidation that goes uninvestigated by local law enforcement. Parker requested additional troops to secure the area, but dispatches show his request was denied due to troop reductions as Reconstruction policies shifted. Court records from this period show the creation of legal structures that effectively criminalized aspects of free black life. County court dockets from 1866 through 1870 are filled with vagrancy charges against freed people who left plantations seeking better opportunities. These charges typically resulted in forced labor arrangements euphemistically called county leasing programs. A ledger from Harrison County, discovered during an archival reorganization in 1939, showed that 78% of individuals leased to private enterprises through this system were formerly enslaved people charged with vagrancy or similar minor offenses. What these documents collectively demonstrate is that June 19th began a process rather than completing one. The formal announcement of freedom in Galveston represented not an endpoint, but rather the opening of a new chapter filled with both possibility and systematic opposition. The struggle that began with emancipation continued through Reconstruction and beyond, documented in government reports, court records, land disputes, and eventually commemorative practices. Perhaps the most telling records are those documenting the emergence of Juneteenth as a celebration. Newspaper accounts from the 1870s show that June 19th quickly became an important date of community commemoration among black Texans. An article in the Galveston Daily News from June 20th, 1872, notes with evident disapproval, The colored population virtually ceased all productive activity yesterday to engage in their annual celebration of what they call Juneteenth. Streets were filled with idle Negroes from sunrise until well past acceptable hours. This backhanded documentation inadvertently preserved evidence of how significant the date had become just 7 years after Granger's announcement. More revealing are the financial records showing community efforts to create permanent spaces for these celebrations. Deed records from Houston show that in 1872, a group of former enslaved people, led by Reverend Jack Yates, pooled resources to purchase land specifically for Juneteenth celebrations. The deed of sale, preserved in Harris County records, shows a purchase price of $800 for 10 acres that would become Emancipation Park, a space that exists to this day. Similar efforts occurred across Texas, with land records showing at least 7 other parcels purchased specifically for emancipation celebrations between 1870 and 1880. These celebrations became increasingly formalized over time. Program booklets from the 1890s show organized parades, speeches, baseball games, and communal meals. One such program from an 1894 celebration in San Antonio, preserved in the Institute of Texan Culture's archive, lists activities beginning at sunrise with prayers and concluding after sunset with what was described as illuminations and music. The back of the program contains a handwritten note, "Largest gathering yet." Estimated 1,200 in attendance, no incidents despite sheriff's concerns. This note hints at the tensions that often surrounded these celebrations. Indeed, municipal records from various Texas cities document attempts to restrict or prevent Juneteenth commemorations. City Council minutes from Dallas in 1887 include debate over an ordinance to prohibit large gatherings of colored citizens without specific permit and supervision. The measure passed, but was apparently difficult to enforce, as newspaper accounts from subsequent years continued to describe Juneteenth celebrations in the city. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the documentation of Juneteenth becomes more robust, but also reflects changing circumstances. Programs from the early 1900s show increasingly elaborate celebrations, often featuring prominent speakers and attracting thousands of attendees. However, these same decades saw the entrenchment of Jim Crow segregation, with state and local records documenting the systematic dismantling of many Reconstruction-era gains. Land records from this period show a troubling pattern. Several sites purchased for Juneteenth celebrations were lost through tax foreclosures, eminent domain claims, or other legal mechanisms. A 1912 court filing from Bastrop County documents the loss of a 3-acre emancipation ground through what the plaintiffs alleged was a manipulated tax assessment. The court ruled against the black landowners, and within a year the property had been repurposed for a whites-only park. Despite these challenges, Juneteenth persisted as a day of memory and celebration. Oral histories collected in the 1930s describe elaborate community preparations for the day. One account from Martha Jefferson, recorded when she was 91 years old, recalled, "Everybody saved up for Juneteenth. Weeks before, people would put aside a little flour, a cup of sugar, perhaps a chicken. On the day, everyone brought what they had, and somehow it always seemed like plenty." This collective approach to celebration reflected both the economic realities facing black communities and the communal values that helped sustain them. The Great Migration brought Juneteenth beyond Texas, with celebrations documented in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Oakland by the 1920s. A program from a 1927 Juneteenth event in Oakland, preserved in the African American Museum and Library collection, shows clear continuity with Texas traditions while adapting to new circumstances. The program includes a reading of Granger's orders, community meals and music, but adds new elements including voter registration drives and labor organizing information. World War II marked another turning point in Juneteenth documentation. Military records show that black soldiers from Texas continued to mark the day even while deployed overseas. A report from a quartermaster unit stationed in England in 1944 notes, "Unusual request approved for special meal preparation on June 19th. Texas men organized program including historical presentations and singing. Morale notably improved." These observations underscore how the memory of emancipation sustained communities even during another global conflict. In the post-war years, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, Juneteenth took on renewed significance. Organizational records from groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee show references to Juneteenth as both historical inspiration and contemporary rallying point. A SNCC field report from 1963 observes, "Local celebrations of June 19th provide natural gathering opportunities for voter education and community organizing. Communities already understand this date as significant to freedom struggles." The most comprehensive documentation of Juneteenth's evolution comes through newspaper coverage, particularly in the black press. Archives of papers like the Houston Informer, the Dallas Express, and later the Forward Times provide year-by-year accounts of how celebrations adapted to changing social conditions. These accounts show how Juneteenth served multiple functions simultaneously, as historical commemoration, community celebration, cultural affirmation, and political platform. By the late 20th century, Juneteenth had begun to receive official recognition, with legislative records documenting Texas's declaration of Juneteenth as a state holiday in 1980. The official legislative record contains testimony from descendants of enslaved Texans who described family traditions of celebration stretching back generations. One witness testified, "My great-grandmother was 9 years old when freedom came to Texas. Until she died in 1954, at age 98, she never once missed celebrating Juneteenth. Through her, our family has maintained an unbroken chain of remembrance." What emerges from this documentary record is a story of persistence, of a community that transformed the memory of delayed freedom into an enduring tradition of commemoration and celebration. The delay that made Juneteenth necessary became, paradoxically, the catalyst for its creation as a distinct cultural institution. The very fact that freedom came so belatedly to Texas created a specific date and circumstance that could be remembered, marked, and passed down through generations. The story that began on June 19, 1865, continues to evolve. Archive collections now include materials from Juneteenth celebrations across all 50 states and several foreign countries. What started as a Texas observance has expanded into a broader commemoration of emancipation and its complex legacy. Yet, at its core, Juneteenth remains rooted in that specific historical moment when freedom, delayed but not denied, finally reached the last enslaved Americans. The historical record reminds us that emancipation was not a single event, but a process, uneven, contested, and often painfully slow. The gap between legal freedom and lived freedom that Juneteenth commemorates has narrowed over generations, but has never fully closed. The annual celebrations serve as both recognition of how far we have come and acknowledgement of distance yet to travel. In archives across Texas and the nation, the documentary evidence of this journey remains incomplete but compelling. It tells a story of information controlled and finally released, of freedom proclaimed but unevenly implemented, and of a community that transformed the memory of delay into an enduring tradition of celebration. June 19, 1865, marked not the end of struggle, but a crucial milestone within it, a day worth remembering not because it completed the work of freedom, but because it reminds us that such work is never complete. The final entry in the last journal of Frederick Douglass, dated June 19, 1895, perhaps captures this truth most eloquently. He wrote, 30 years since the first Juneteenth. Freedom comes at different times to different people. For some by proclamation, for others by the march of armies, for still others by the quiet assertion of their own humanity. But it never comes completely, and never comes without cost. The work of each generation is to extend and secure what previous generations have won, and to understand that freedom is never finally achieved, but always in the process of being achieved. That understanding, documented in diaries, newspapers, land records, and commemorative practices, remains Juneteenth's most enduring legacy. The celebration marks not just a historical moment, but an ongoing process, a reminder that freedom is never simply given, only taken, never merely declared, only realized through continued vigilance and commitment. The delayed emancipation that Juneteenth commemorates stands as both historical fact and potent metaphor, a reminder that the distance between proclamation and reality can be measured not just in miles and months, but in the persistent effort required to make freedom's promise real for all.